Now, talk to me about House of Eve. And I'm almost jealous of the people that have had the chance to read it already because everyone is just raving about it. And then the blurb that's on your website made me want to read it because, especially Howard University. And then I can understand how it's different people coming to HBCUs. And sometimes you have different people with different objectives. And just from the blurb, it makes me want to read it. And it's probably going to be my first fiction book that I'm going to read just because we had this conversation. So talk
Wow.
to me about it. And talk to me about why you chose Howard as such a prominent place in the book.
Well, The House of Eve is my fifth novel. It's my second historical. And it was inspired by my grandmother. I was fooling around trying to figure out what my next story was going to be. And I had a character. Her name was Ruby. And I knew that she lived in North Philadelphia. I knew that she was in danger, but I didn't know what else. So I started to think about my grandmother and things that she told me. And she said that she was always the black sheep of her family. She was 14 when she got pregnant with my mother out of wedlock in the early 1950s, which was taboo and full of shame. People didn't do that. It's not the way it is now, right? And so she had my mother at 15. And because there was so much family shame around it, they hid the pregnancy from everyone, including my mother. So my mother tells me that she didn't know my grandmother was her mother until she was in the third grade, because at that point she had lived with her grandmother and it had been this great secret. And I could always see this sort of tension between them. They had this tumultuous relationship. I clearly knew that they loved each other, but there was all of this other tension, friction between them. And then I started wondering, like, well, what would life have been like for my grandmother if things had been different? If she wasn't, Black woman, poor, North Philadelphia, what would life have been like? And so I started researching and I came across these maternity homes. Between 1945 and 1975, 1.5 million babies were born in these homes. These women, these young girls, unmarried and pregnant, went into these homes to have their babies. Oftentimes, they were forced and coerced to give up their children. This was before IVF. This was before adoption was something that was celebrated. And so they were shamed and coerced into giving up these children. But when I was looking closer into these maternity homes, I couldn't find a single Black woman's story within these homes. And I thought, well, what options and opportunities does my grandmother would have, And then I thought, well, there has to be another group, right? So I read the book Our Kind of People by Lawrence Otis Graham, which you're a nonfiction reader, so I'm sure you would really enjoy that one. And he talks a lot about the upper echelon, the upper class Black community in the right after Reconstruction up through the 80s. And he talked about DC and New York and Chicago. And so I was really specifically interested in the DC portion of the book. And I learned that most of them went to Howard. Most of these affluent Black people were doctors and lawyers and judges and activists. And, they were a tight knit community. They lived in the Gold Coast. They did things together. And it was hard to break into this community if you couldn't trace your wealth back a few generations, if you weren't very light skinned, if you didn't play that part. So that is what brought me to Howard University. I was watching Toni Morrison's documentary, The Pieces I Am, and she said, I didn't know that Black people separated themselves by color until I stepped foot on Howard University in the 1950s. And so I thought, wow, what if I had a character who was from the Midwest? She was from Ohio, Toni Morrison, and she comes to Howard University, and this is all a big shock to her system. And so that was where the character Eleanor came in. And I started to weave the story between Ruby and Eleanor using Philadelphia as a backdrop and Washington, D.C., Black Broadway, and Howard University as I told this story.